no tātou, nā mihi o te rā ki te whānau e hui nei, kia tau te rangi Mārie, kia whakatāpua tātou me ngā mea, e whakapono o ngā tātou haumie, huie, wākie. Greetings of the day to the whānau gathered here. Let peace be with us, and may we respect each other in what we believe. Bind together, gather together, united. And our whakatauki to see us into this session. One of my favourites. It's very apt. Mā te rongo ka mōhio, mā te mōhio ka marama, mā te marama ka mātua, mā te mātau ka ora. From listening comes knowledge, from knowledge comes understanding, from understanding comes wisdom, and from wisdom comes well-being. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Kia ora, everybody, and just introducing our team. We'll start with Louise.
Yeah, hi, my name is Louise. I'm Cluster 17 RTLB, part of the Professional Learning Network in the amazing Waikato. Leonie is also Cluster 17. Unfortunately, she's tied up at the moment doing some other stuff. So she will be around the next time.
I'm standing in for Leonie. Kia ora, ko Fiona Hakusaho.
And kia ora, I'm Jo Cook-Bonnie, ko Ōtepoti and way down in Dunedin, and I'm very excited to be here. Just some housekeeping, please mute unless sharing. We are recording this session and we'll share with you later. Let's connect, inspire and uplift each other. Add any gems partai to the chat throughout the session. We will be keeping a record of these to guide our next webinar.
Okay, so today we have the amazing, so our agenda, for today is Sasha, an occupational therapist from the Waikato, is going to be speaking about sensory spaces. Once we've finished with that, we will hopefully have some time for questions. If not, please put your questions in the chat as we're going along, and then we can address them later on. And the next steps will be the last thing that we do. Okay, so introducing Sasha. Sasha is an occupational therapist in the Waikato. He lives at the seaside. He lives in Raglan, so he's very fortunate to have that beautiful environment to live in. He's an occupational therapist in private practice, but also for the Ministry of Education. And I have known Sasha for about 7 or 8 years now, and he is going to talk about sensory stuff. Sasha, welcome.
Thanks, Louise. That's a pretty good introduction. Thank you very much. Nice to be here today. Thank you for the invitation to talk today. Yeah, I'm going to be talking about, I guess, sensory processing, occupational therapy, and what it looks like in the classroom. Do a lot of work in this space, like Louise has highlighted, work for the Ministry of Education, doing a lot of work along with a lot of kids, AWS kids, behavior kids, around this space in schools and also in private practice. And what I'm finding in private practice is a lot of not particularly diagnosed kids, but definitely, they could be on the spectrum coming my way through private practice because parents are really struggling. So there's a lot of need out in this area. I've done a lot of workshops on this and I see the demands out there. So please think of questions if you do have questions, and we'll talk about it at the end and think about scenarios in your own personal work that you find there's some question marks. Okay, cool. Fantastic. So I've done a PowerPoint. I've sort of just tailored it to this webinar. I might expand on a few things. If I miss something, just remember it and ask me later. But yeah, pretty much just talking about creating classrooms that support sensory needs. What is sensory processing? Sensory processing is a physiological process originating from the central nervous system that allows human beings the ability to control and process their sensory stimuli and therefore exhibit an appropriate behavior response. And that last bit is the most important. But I guess why I've put this slide in there is because when I get into schools and working with families, everyone thinks sensory processing is something different, you know, or something very special. But in reality, it's something we all do, neurodiverse or not. It's a developmental stage, biological functioning, and you know, it's sorry, just excuse me, just got a bit of interruption here in my room. And yeah, so it's something we all do, and the difference between us and neurodiverse, as you all know, is that appropriate behavior response, and that's obviously what we see. So it's a very fast process. We'll talk about sensory discrimination that happens in its typical development. So understanding sensory needs, why sensory-friendly classrooms or learning spaces matter. So I've just put two pictures of the brain, and these are the parts just to demonstrate which parts of the brain are involved in sensory processing. So as you can see, you've got the, without me pointing to the slides, you've got the bottom of the part, the brainstem, which controls your flight or fight response. And then you've got that middle part, which is all the pituitary gland, hypothalamus, thalamus, midbrain, all controlling with your memories, how your hormones react. So we talk about interoception as well, your balance, proprioception. So as you can see, you know, just highlighting that part of the brain, it's crucial to functioning, you know. And I guess in what I'm trying to demonstrate is that if you don't address sensory processing, it gets worse. It's not something you can ignore. So kids with sensory needs, neurodiverse kids with sensory needs, the only way to get optimal functioning is to really understand their sensory needs, take it into account, and really target that. And there's many ways you can do that. But, you know, neurodiversity becoming really common nowadays. 1 in 7 people are neurodivergent. And this is growing, you know, seeing a lot of kids coming through my way, some diagnosed, some aren't, and particularly the high functioning, you know, a lot of high functioning kids on the spectrum, autistic, coming my way, and definitely, and, you know, not those kids that don't necessarily have behavior concerns outright in the classroom, but there are issues down the line. And targeting sensory needs, it's all about participation, promotes participation, accessibility, inclusion, and ultimately well-being. You know, and as I said before, it's inherent, it's essential to the evolution of the brain and its typical functioning. And what we're hoping for is moderate arousal. So hyperarousal or under-arousal is not, you know, it's not optimal and not sustainable, which is why you really need to address it. And you all will know, for yourselves what state of mind is best for you to be able to do. And it's all task dependent as well. Traditional teaching methods, they often overlook diverse needs, and they do not account for the individual and broad sensory needs of each person to function the best. We all know that, you know, you get different learning environments, model learning environments, single cell learning environments. Sometimes the teaching pedagogy doesn't always allow for sensory needs to be met or different ways of learning. And ultimately what we're trying to do is help reduce anxiety, stress, and behavior challenges. That's the big thing, you know, and people know if you're in the stress response too long, how you feel. It's not good. I put this pyramid in there. I mean, this is a pyramid. I've seen a lot of teaching pyramids that are similar but different. This is a pyramid that when we talk about occupational therapy in the literature and occupational therapy, this one comes up. And usually when I'm doing a presentation to an audience, like in physical presence, I always ask them, what do you think? And do you agree or not? Because again, it's just to illustrate where it sits, sensory processing. It's right at the bottom. You know, if you think about Maslow's hierarchy, that pyramid is a similar type scenario, kind of make connections. But as you can see, you know, sensory is right at the bottom, all your sensory systems. And then from there, everything builds on. So like I said, typical development. And, you know, what we're dealing with, and you guys as RTLB is always looking at the top part of the pyramid, academic learning and behavior. You know, I see a lot of kids at that top part as well, behavior, academic learning, activities, daily living. But often something's been missed or hasn't been addressed in between, and how much steps has been missed. You know, so once they get to that top part of the period and there are issues, it does take a lot of work to get them back on track, and it takes buy-in and consistency to see progress. And, you know, nowadays what I'm seeing, particularly in kindergarten, there's a lot of kids, especially from COVID and stuff, coming out of that, that haven't been exposed to a variety of environments. Naturally, normal development for little kids is to really explore their sensory systems, take risks, calculate, not calculate a risk, but take risks within safe environments and really develop all those sensory systems. But we've seen a lot of kids that having delayed behaviors, and taking risks much later on. I've had a lot of requests from kinder coming in because they've had a lot of kids taking over the top type risk, climbing very high because they've come from that sort of, that COVID sort of situation where they were stuck inside on screens all the time. So when we talk about sensory processing, you've got different types, and you guys might have heard some of these. You've got lower arousal, which results in a lack of awareness of sensory information. So I'm not picking up enough of what you want me to. And then you've got high arousal, which results in behavior disorganization, emotional responses, anxiety, and stress. So often, this is what we see. We see a lot of those particularly high AUS kids, AUS on the spectrum with that high arousal, and it results in behavior disorganization. So, quite intense behaviors, and they often require those really intense experiences, but it's not sustainable to provide that. The behavior disorganization also happens because of sensory overload, not just a meltdown or something. And then you get over arousal, which may lead to a shutdown or a meltdown. This is what we try and avoid. We do see this quite a bit. Under arousal may lead to sensory information not being registered, and therefore lack of participation and engagement. And those are the kids that just sit there, a lot of the times, you come into the classroom and people always worry, behavior shouts that loud because you want to stop the behavior, and it's disrupting or it's hurting others. But people don't realize that those kids sitting there in the corner daydreaming is, in my view, when I come in, it's just as bad. Because it's disengagement, and in the long run, disengagement, potentially could lead to a lack of motivation, not interested, lack of progress, and eventually just sort of not wanting to participate in anything at all. So both kids require support, a different way of doing it. And if I was to think about classic examples of how what sorts of kids present a certain way, I would probably say that, you get a lot of those high AUS, high sensory seeker type children, especially on the spectrum. That high arousal definitely stands at the forefront. And you get a lot of high functioning autistic children, particularly girls, where that under arousal is I'm not jumping ahead now with the next slide. That under arousal is there where they don't always say that they don't understand. They mask a lot, and they don't always eventually disengage, and they don't always participate to the best that they can. But we don't realize because that behavior component's not there, so that there's nothing we feel that we need to address. But that under arousal, that masking behavior that happens in the long run is not sustainable, and likely produces higher levels of anxiety down the line and sense of self. So both need to be addressed. And it's common in neurodiverse. It's really important to understand that, but it's relevant for all of us. And you guys all know for yourselves, what do I need to focus the best? I know for myself that if I'm spending a lot of time at a computer, definitely movement breaks, vestibular feedback, proprioceptive feedback is what keeps me alert and regulated. Yeah, this is the other slide I was thinking about when I was talking about. So when we talk about all things sensory, you've got sensory seeking, sensory, and you guys would have heard this, it's not, you guys, I'm sure you would have come across these terms, sensory seeking, sensory avoiding, sensory sensitivity, and lower registration. And, all of us, not just neurodiverse, if I was to do your sensory profile on yourself, we may, if you may sit in one of those categories, or in some in here and some in there. But as we know, a lot of neurodiverse kids, particularly on the spectrum, that high sensory seeking type behavior. And sensory seeking is typical behavior for younger kids, kindergarten type thing. So when I get a request for kindergarten, and that they're doing these extremes behavior, it's not always concerning because it's them testing out their sensory systems, wanting to access that typical behavior in terms of sensory seeking, but usually in their primary school, intermediate, and this type of behavioral pattern can cause a lot of issues. And I'm sure you guys have been caught in to look at some of those. I've definitely been caught in to look at, and I guess the main thing is that with these children presenting with this high sensory seeking behavior, you know, they've got an active self-regulation strategy. And it's really important to understand that, because what I say to schools, if you've got a high sensory seeker, and you'll know because they're always moving, busy, loud, singing, really struggle with those sedentary type tasks, really struggle with those focused, attentive type tasks, you know, they've got an active self-regulation strategy. So either if you stop them from doing what they're doing, an example is if a kid, you know, is, you know, let's say he's sitting at a desk and he's writing, for example, which is one of those classic trigger type scenarios, and he, you know, he starts getting louder and some sounds or voice or things that he's saying, or he starts moving quite a bit, and you know, that can appear to be quite disruptive to some teachers. But what the people don't realize is that he has to move at that particular point. It's a regulation strategy, and it's an active self-reg. And if we try and stop that, things can go south. You know, if we, particularly with these high sensory seekers, particularly on the spectrum, and the best practice is, you know, thinking about, okay, if you need to do that, how can you do that in a way that's approved for my expectations plus the context? And that's the part that, you know, I'm often looking at, because sometimes our expectations are too set in stone. And what we don't realize is that these kids have an active self-regulation strategy, so they have to do that. And the more we push, the more intense their behavior gets, and likely then becomes disorganized or slash out or throw something. And we don't realize that we could have stopped that previously. And then you've got a sensory avoider who's got a low threshold for sensory input and an active self-regulation strategy. So often high sensory seekers like those on the spectrum goes hand in hand with sensory avoidant. Very sensory seeking, but on one hand, very particular about what they don't like. Both active self-regulation. So again, will remove themselves, will throw something, will lash out to someone. And it's really important, but when you have someone who presents this type of behavior, to really understand their sensory needs and really cater to that, because you're likely going to see disorganized behavior and naturally them doing things to regulate themselves, and without the structure and scaffolding in terms of what's appropriate and what's not appropriate, you're just going to get into a tug of war type scenario. Sensory sensitivity, a low threshold with a passive self-regulation strategy. So, you know, these are those kids that are very aware of what's going on in the environment, very distractible. I'm finding out a lot of kids that I see, particularly girls, again, on the spectrum, high functioning, I would say, pretty onto it, but not diagnosed always. I'm finding that these girls are sort of sitting under the radar because there's no behavior, challenging behavior as such. But what I'm saying is that, you know, that they're very dependent on certain factors like a familiar peer or the teacher's directive, very clear. And that's keeping them together. And it's almost like they're running on this wheel with those factors. And if you remove one of those factors, they collapse. And I've seen that before. So in terms of independence, that they don't have independence, and it's misleading because they appear to be keeping it all together. But really, if you when I look at their profile, you know, I'll do their profile for school, and their school profile will come out as expected. You know, they're performing relatively well, pretty high scores in sensory sensitivity and low registration, but average scores in seeking and avoiding, which tells me that their stress response is just managing. But they are very distractible from the environment, and they're one of those kids that just sits there. You know, they won't do anything because they mask a lot, and they won't ask the teacher for help. They won't show that they are any different because they're so. I guess the point is that these kids need to understand what they need, how to meet their sensory needs in a way that is approved. All they want to know is that I can meet my sensory needs and you're okay with that. They won't ask you. They're not they don't have an active self-regulation. If they need to move, they'll get up and go. They're not they're not like that. They're one of those kids that will sit there, and when a trigger scenario happens, it's going to build, the anxiety is going to build. And long term, sense of self, anxiety management, that all becomes factors that really impact them down the line, particularly in high school. And low registration goes hand in hand. Sensory students all around how much I'm picking up in the environment, often really distractible. And low registration is the same thing. You've got a really high threshold, but a passive self-regulation. So you need a lot of sensory support in terms of what's coming at you to really understand how to meet expectations. And a lot of the high functioning population, again, particularly girls, fall in this category where they need solid structure, solid scaffolding. They need the teacher to be really directive with them. They need a visual cue. They need those, for example, those factors I spoke to you about, the teacher's directive, the peer, to be able to understand what the expectations are and follow through with that. And that structure, that scaffolded system is, is their independence as such. I've got girls where at home, they're really reliant on that to get them through. And that it's like a system, and the parents have done the right thing by focusing on that. But it's really important to understand that it's not just behavior kids, in terms of those kids that you see lashing out that need support. Those kids that disengage and just sit there are just as bad in my book. Both are going to need support at different points of the journey. Now we're going to talk about the sensory systems. And I'm sure you guys have heard, you guys are familiar with some of the sensory systems. Obviously, we've got interoception, which is inside the body. This is a really important sensory system to understand, essential for maintenance of homeostasis, survival, hunger, thirst, experience, perception of safety. So there's one that people miss. A lot of autistic kids really, really struggle with this part of their sensory systems. Don't pick up on their natural cues, don't pick up on their thirst cues, don't pick up on their hunger cues. Trauma kids are historically known to really, really struggle with mind-body connection, not knowing how they're feeling, if they're too hungry, if they're too thirsty. And, tolerant in some ways, alongside the other issues that they have, this is one of the factors that influence the tolerance, which makes tolerance so difficult for autistic children, because they're not aware of their internal cues. And why I've put it in there, because sometimes, when you get a kid who's got sensory challenges in the classroom, or you're finding some behavior challenges, sometimes it's really thinking about interoception. Are they aware? Because some of these basic functionings, like being too hungry, too thirsty, adjusting your routines in terms of morning tea, or when they can access their food, for example, because we get so caught up on they have to do it at this time. And we get in a lot of, as it builds up to that time, we may get some challenges with behavior, a little bit disorganized. And sometimes in a simple adjustment of that routine, allowing access to their lunchbox prior to everyone else can make a difference. I had a kid where you got to look at their lunchbox, and we know a lot of autistic kids are very picky eaters. So you look at their lunchbox, it tells you a lot about what they seek. But I had a kid, for example, that ate a high calorie in terms of like high processed diet, and like those carbs, sweet carbs. So his lunchbox was that, and he was a high ORS, non-verbal, autistic, high ORS, strong sensory seeker, proprioceptive driven, vestibular driven. So what the school was struggling with is a busy boy who very forceful with his touch, moving all the time, very disorganized. And what we didn't realize is that part of one of the challenges was that in the morning, he'd have a high processed breakfast, high sugary breakfast, and that spiked his blood sugar, in terms of like that extra boost that he got at school. And once we identified that and adjusted that, and what we had said to mum is that it's not on you. What we do is we'd adjust the simple routine. We might bring his morning tea a little bit earlier, but also we started making sort of pancakes, more dense, oat type pancakes, which he enjoyed. So that was a win, but that really helped to reduce some of that disorganized behavior. And that's an example of how you target that interoception. Exteroception, these are all the ones you can see: olfactory, your smell; gustatory, taste; visual, auditory, tactile. And these are the common ones. You know, and if I was to think about sensory processing and how I would rank sensory systems, I'd look at these as in terms of like when I'm designing learning for the kids, how do I target these sensory systems? You know, how am I thinking about the visual sensory system, auditory, tactile? And obviously, you know, I get a lot of people saying, oh, the trigger is the sounds and the visual, but it's not always. Sometimes the trigger is you haven't captured enough of that sensory system. Now, they're very tactile driven, they're disengaging, you're pushing, and they lash out. You haven't increased the intensity or often thought about adjusting activities. For example, you know, maths, a lot of kids might respond to maths if it's more tactile driven, and they're using visual cues to organize patterns and all that sort of stuff. You know, auditory, background noise, all that type of thing can be really helpful. And it's just being really mindful, you know, smell, for example, is a very powerful sensory system. Be mindful if you've got a kid with high avoidant type behavior, high sensory seeking type behavior, a lot of anxiety, to be very mindful of the smell side of things, because it's very intrinsic, you know, it's very connected to their amygdala in terms of what they smell alerts their brain whether it's a danger or not. You know, if you think about yourself, if you smell gas, for example, or petrol, automatically you know, I gotta look around. It's a very fast reaction, and sometimes the trigger can be a cologne you may be wearing, or a strong smell of a particular item in the classroom or something like that, that could be setting this kid off. It's something we don't always think about because it's not seen. And then we've got proprioception and vestibular. I would say a lot of the research around sensory processing, if you look at it, it refers to proprioception and vestibular as powerhouse sensory systems. They are, in terms of, I've done a lot of profiles, I've done a lot of sensory assessments. I can tell you now, proprioception and vestibular dominate in terms of like what helps the child regulate and either be alert or help them calm down. And I don't know, and they will always show you, you know, if you really analyze these kids, they will show you what they prefer. And they often prefer both. And it's at different points in their day and depending on different demands. But proprioception definitely helps to more likely to calm down, more likely to bring them back down. This is not when they're having a meltdown. A meltdown, you know, as you guys would know as well, is game over. What I would say is game over. You let them have the meltdown, keep them safe, keep everyone else safe, keep yourself safe. But meltdown is a loss of control. This is when they're approaching the, you know, disorganized, getting escalated phase. Proprioception can really help bring them back down. You know, it's all around your body awareness, coordination. You've got very strong receptors at the end of your fingers, at all the end of your joints. They tell you how to move your body, where your body is. You know, you can imagine if you're standing in a room, and I always do this when I'm talking to people in a room, I say, like, if I'm standing here, you are all a certain distance away from me, but my body is telling me that you're just, you know, you're over there. I know that I can control myself. I know how far everyone is. It's quite reassuring. But kids who have problems with proprioception, it's almost like they're always trying to connect to where their body is. They don't understand hard touch versus soft touch. You know, how many times have we had a high autistic child that, you know, you're playing a game and then all of a sudden they throw it like it's next level, break it. They don't understand how, you know, how their body works. Issues with the handwriting. Resistance weighted type activities is how you capture the proprioception. If you look at their lunchbox, 9 times out of 10, crunchy items, you know, biting intensely on items, because you've got very strong proprioceptors in the back of your jaw, hugely powerful, like they're connected to your vagus nerve, which is just behind your jawbone, and that initiates your parasympathetic phase, so rest and digest. Crunchy, so allowing, you know, even allowing access, like I said, access to the lunchbox, where that access, that crunchy can help stimulate that, bring them back down from that disorganized state. And then you've got vestibular, which is, again, movement, sense of balance, movement of the head in space, can be hugely calming and support alertness. I find that tends to support alertness. So, kids that are, doing too much of a sedentary type task, or getting them outside on a swing, or a movement break. Dance has been really successful for a lot of the younger, 5-6-year-old neurodiverse kids. I've had teachers when I've said to them, what's your normal routine? You've got dance, so put dance first rather than up there. And teachers told me that it's actually been really successful, because as soon as that child shows up to school, which we can assume, for any autistic child coming to school, the anxiety is already up. The avoidant response kicks in, stress response kicks in, and depending on how the morning routine goes, whether they're rushed, they miss something, dad and mum, communication, whatever it is to them, they're already heightened when they come to school. So having dance straight away helps bring them back down, plus also keep them alert for the next, whether it's a less preferred activity or not. And sometimes just allowing regular movement breaks, which is something so simple, but we don't realize that expectations are so set in stone that we don't allow enough movement breaks, not just for neurodiverse kids, but for everyone, because it can be really beneficial in just resetting that particular child. And you get a lot of kids, if you ever, again, a lot of kids that we see, you get those kids that walk on the balls of their feet, the heels up, straight off the bat. If they never raise their heel back down, that suggests to you that they've got problems with their vestibular system. So automatically, in terms of capturing their sensory needs, vestibular movement is going to be in there in terms of their schedule for the week, or their sensory diet, which is just their pretty much their schedule for the week. I would throw vestibular movement in there, because they'll be seeking that as a way of trying to organize themselves. So when I do this slide in particular, I always ask for feedback from the crowd, because I say, what do you think? You guys are educators, professionals in your own right. Do you agree or disagree? So obviously we do it online, and we'll ask at the end. But, these are potential problems you might see with people that have sensory processing difficulties. And again, early schooling, it's a tricky one. Early schooling, kindergarten, I've done a few private assessments in kindergarten, and I tell you what, the neurodiverse kid doesn't necessarily stand out. He's presenting as he should, within expectations, unless there's huge punching, biting type behaviors, which, to be honest, at that level, early schooling, a lot of kids are like, they're all learning those socially appropriate behaviors. So he doesn't necessarily stand out. And, in kindergarten is a unique environment where there are rules and expectations, but they're quite fluid in a way. Kids aren't forced to do anything. Kids are free to access these sensory systems. Naturally, when I've seen some of the neurodiverse kids pick and choose what routines they will engage in, so mat time or social type scenarios, not interested, but they'll access all the different learning activities and might do a routine around food or anything like that. But yeah, early learning, a little bit, you've just got to be clear about what are you actually seeing here, because again, it's part of normal child development, but particularly that primary school, intermediate stage. If you get to high school, like I said to you, and I've got a few kids at high school, and you've got sensory processing challenges there at high school stage, it's really hard. It can be really difficult. You get a lot of emotional regulation difficulties, challenges with social connections, which go hand in hand. Alongside this, it's understanding autism, understanding ADHD, self-esteem issues. But the high school phase, you're often, if you're at that level and you haven't targeted their sensory needs from way on and really come up with a system or plan to support their transition through their schooling. So this is how we meet their sensory needs. This is how their learning looks like. This is what keeps them on the right track. It's really, really difficult. And it really comes down to the belief of the team, the consistency of the team, because what you're going to experience, and what I'm saying is probably it's real world experience, because I'm dealing with a few cases like this now where we're in high school, and the kids get older and bigger. So, these kids that seek big proprioceptive activities, and if you haven't focused on how do we provide that in appropriate ways, they will seek that in the high school space, and it's intense. It's big movements, and they throw something, and it's intense, loud, but the team are dealing a lot with trying to manage their sensory needs and provide and keep them regulated. And often academics gone. You know, we push academic in school, we push, you got to do this, do that. But when they get to high school, the reality is you're often dealing with that quite a bit. But yeah, it's usually the primary school, intermediate schooling age where if you can get things on track, you know, you get a lot of kids that really, you know, the behavior issues is what we see, but poor organization, writing difficulties, keeping up with emotion regulation, all part of it. And then you get the intermediate, they kind of go hand in hand, you know, again, behavior difficulties, challenges with team sport, proprioception issues, the executive functioning, you know, you've got to really think about the diagnosis, what you're seeing, because we know a lot of kids on the spectrum, ADHD, really struggle with executive functioning, you know, in terms of planning, organizing, you know, and that's why, you know, like I get a lot of things like people try things with sensory, they try things and it doesn't work. They say to me, no, it doesn't work. We tried it, you didn't buy it. But what they don't realize is you can't expect them to buy it straight away. And also, when we put something in place, for example, like I've put a trike in a school for a really high needs, high AWS child who thrives on high vestibular and proprioceptive inputs. And the trike is one of the only activities you can really meet that high threshold because it's quite an intense. You can adapt it. You know, you can go faster and faster. But the school have said to me, "Oh, it's not working anymore." Because he's not showing interest. But what they don't realize is that that's not actually the case, that he's got significant challenges with executive functioning. So the message with sensory stuff is when you do something, you know, it's to give it, you've got to be consistent and you can't stop doing it after 1 or 2, 3 days. You've got to go at least 4 weeks, 6 weeks, consistent and always review things. But there are some things like those high intensity things that you've always got to have, and you've got to understand what is sensory, but what is also part of their diagnosis in terms of executive functioning challenges, where we know they don't understand what task initiation looks like with planning, with maintaining engagement on something for better outcome, all that sort of stuff. Then we get to tools and strategies. So, you know, often when we're going into the school, when I'm going into schools and looking at kids with sensory needs, it's all around performance and participation in life routines. And, you know, essentially their school routine, that's a life routine in itself. And what we're wanting to get is an adaptation resulting in a change of a physiological response to something specific. So you'd like them to get familiar with whatever is triggering them, you know, a graded approach. But, you know, that's why it can be very difficult with kids with autism to get there, because they really struggle with habituation, which is a normal part of development, which is human behavior as we habituate to different things and develop a routine around that. But, you know, we get too focused on the child, you know, trying to change different things about the autistic child. But what we don't realize is that we're not going to get there. We're not going to get there if we don't. There's a different way of doing it in terms of focusing on the task and what they need to do, and how do we increase their participation in different things in terms of what's important to them. So when in the very first slide, I mentioned sensory discrimination. That's what it's all about. And that's why that's why sensory processing for neurodiverse population is challenging, because of that process of sensory discrimination, because we do it so quickly, you know, even 5-year-olds, they do it. It's a sophisticated process, evolutionary process, where we just, you know, right now I'm able to narrow out whatever's going on around me, the noises, the stimulate, to focus just on the screen. And that's what I know I need to do to be able to deliver this presentation. And you guys will know what you need to do when you're doing public speaking or anything like that. You do sensory discrimination very, very quickly. And a very classic example of a high level activity that requires habituation, but requires a lot of sensory discrimination. If you think about driving, you know, we hope everyone is able to do that while they're driving, because that's the only way you can do it safely. and deliver a positive outcome. So, I mean, that's why when you've got a kid with sensory processing challenges, it's really important to understand that they struggle with sensory discrimination. So what we assume we should always assume that they pick up everything. You know, people always say that, you know, you've got a kid with attention problems, who's looking around, who's busy, and then you come in the room and people assume, oh, he didn't notice you were here. He didn't really notice you were here. But what they don't realize is that no, he knew I was here, but he chose not to attend to me because at that point I wasn't interesting enough. But I can assure you, if I had a special interest item or dressed up a particular way that he either didn't like or he found favorable, he would have noticed me straight away. And this is important to understand because people don't do the basics in terms of the visual schedule, the visual scaffolding, because they assume, oh, they don't really notice it. They don't. But these kids have next level attention to detail. You know, even lower functioning kids on the spectrum in terms of like, you know, developmentally delayed, their attention to detail is next level. So it really comes down to how you structure your environment, the scaffolding systems that you've got to really inform how you'd like them to perform. What we're looking for is the just right amount, you know, and that's in context. You know, at the end of the day, you've got to grade your expectations to the reality of the context. You know, that's just how it is. There's a model I like to use, which is person, environment, occupation. I aim to address the misfit in those three factors, and often the easiest one to do is the person, is the environment, and the occupation. And sometimes you just got to let go of some occupations because sometimes you already have, you've got the supports there already. You know, you've got your structure, your routines. It needs tailoring, it needs changing. Person's too complex to really have a go at trying to change them. You develop strategies that increase participation of daily routines, and you focus on developing self-regulation skills alongside sensory motor. So self-regulation goes hand in hand. Anytime I'm writing a report, I always have a baseline recommendation around self-regulation strategies. And, you know, that's great. You know, you really look at the child, look at the developmental delays or their cognitive delays, and you decide what does self-regulation look like for them, whether it's supported, prompted, or independent. But if you don't focus on self-regulation and connect that to sensory, they ain't going to make progress, which is what we're doing now in the high school side. Is we really, this child has not learned to self-regulate over the years. And what he's learned is that his behavior, ultimately he's learned that he controls his environment through his behavior. As you guys would understand, classic behavior 101, where if I up the ante with my behavior, people start listening to me. But he hasn't realized that, you know, when we feel different ways, there's another way of solving issues. You don't always have to trash the classroom to get your way, you know. And self-regulation is really important, and you really focus on the activity demands, the context, and the environment. And it's really important to think like that from my perspective, because sometimes we don't realize, we say, you know, I've got a kid who's completely disengaged from the curriculum, doesn't want a bar of it. Beginning teacher just sits outside, makes a lot of noises, pretty clever onto it boy, neurodiverse, ADHD, ASD, but doesn't want to go into a classroom. He'll sit outside, he'll make heaps of noise, he'll run around. Very high sensory seeker. I tell you what, I did his profile, almost full marks in sensory seeking, which tells you that very disorganized behavior. But what we've identified is that the classroom, and particularly writing, is a trigger. So that is really driving his avoidance to get into the classroom, because his sense of self-esteem is so poor. It's you know, he's putting on a front, but the teachers push. You need to come back in the classroom. Push. You need to come in, and he's just pushed back. There's an active self-regulation strategy, so he knows, no, I'm not going in there. I'm going to stay out here and I'm going to run around and do this, and thinking about the demands. So writing, he really struggles with writing. Really struggles with that whole component. And the context, and we've just decided, I've said to them, pull everything back, and why can't he write in the principal's office, which he's happy to do. He likes the principal, but the classroom with the peers around is the trigger. So it's really breaking down what are you asking this child to do and thinking about the context, the environment, the demands of it, because they often drive a lot of these sensory behaviors that you see. It's not always the kid, or it's not always home. It's not always, oh, well, they arrived like that, must be something at home. No, not always. I had a kid yesterday. I got an email yesterday saying, and this is a boy I'm telling you about high school. He trashed it. He had a meltdown again at school, and he trashed the class. He didn't want to get a headbang, all that sort of stuff. And when I read the incident notes, I go straight to that. The activity demand is likely what set him off in terms of like association to demands, because he arrived to school, he's a little bit out of sort, he's much more tired, having a lot of sleeping issues at home, and naturally when he associates activity demand, and they might have introduced it too early in the day, that's what set him off. And you know, kids with sensory processing challenges, their perceptions are inaccurate, and often their reactions are intense but not always matching the what's actually happening. And it's just is, which is why you really need to have a system, clear boundaries, clear structure, and clear ways of managing each reaction, because we can't give in to them. You know, it's about how do we regulate and get through this. I've just put some environmental accommodations, you know, universal design benefits all, you know, so thinking about large spaces, quiet spaces, spaces for work, spaces for, you know, where you can do some preferred, and it has to be in terms of like, if there's a flow or a really solid structure, it'd be a lot easier for the neurodiverse kid to keep up or attend to that. But, you know, if it's just left for children to make their own decision around it, 9 times out of 10, the neurodiverse kid is likely to going to become overwhelmed by that, you know. Strategic auditory accommodations, you know, again, strategic use of the classroom to reduce noise on communication scenarios. Routine access to quiet space. So quiet spaces can be hugely rejuvenating for autistic children, and just having regular access to those spaces. And you know, this goes for those, it goes for the high functioning autism population who won't ask you. They might not say to you, I need to go there. They're trying to mask and trying to keep up and not stand out. But having a quiet space where they know they can go if they need to, or have it really structured, and that's their time that they go, and you've approved that and everything, might help them help teach them how to regulate and what strategies work for them down the line, you know, like then they know they're their own advocates. I need space at this time. I need to go there and do that. And, you know, but background noise, music, a lot of research coming out now that's saying, you know, background noise, very helpful for kids with ADHD, ASD. I did an assessment the other day. I showed up, very high functioning autistic boy, high school level, and he was very anxious with me being there in the room with him and his teacher aide. He wanted music on. He asked his teacher aide, can I play a song? Can I play a song? And she said, no. And I'm glad she eventually said to him yes, because I could tell it really brought back down his anxiety. So it's you know, it's being flexible about, because sometimes we say no, or sometimes we say, no, you can't, why do you get background noise and they don't? So if you can do a universal strategy of, you know, potentially some nice music in the background, or you know, some universal strategies, you know, if it's a big deal for everyone else, why can't that kid have his own setup in terms of headphones, and he knows that he plays this while he's doing that, and you make the rules around there, you know, as long as it's not a distraction, more than happy for you to do that if I can see that you get your work done. Noisy environments like playground, hallways, or cafeteria. Rehearse access to quiet spaces or spaces to limit exposure. Really important, you know, like in a high school space, for example, really sensory, child with sensory challenges, really triggered by that busy recess time or transition times in a high school when all the corridors are busy. And that often triggers them. Is really think about a rehearsed, clear pathway to where you need to get, you know, from your learning space to the next learning space, and just keeping it the same and tailoring your times has been hugely successful for some high school kids that I've worked with, where we've just said, we're only going to go this way, takes the lift, the shortcut going down, and it's at a different time, and you have it structured in there, and it's allowing that flexibility in what he's doing versus what everyone else is doing. Visual accommodations, some of the obvious ones, you know, those lighting, those halogen instead of fluorescent lighting, that can be really, even for us, you know, we look at it, not just neurodiverse, but bright. And this is a tricky one because it comes down to how the teacher feels about it. You know, some teachers are a bit, it's an expression of themselves. Some of them are quite into what they've got on their walls, but you just being mindful of what does their classroom environment look like, because if I'm trying to get neurodiverse kids to focus, sometimes perceived clutter can be a distraction and lead to overwhelm. Or if I think about what this child's interested in, and if I've got anything in the environment that he might be interested in, that could be a really big distraction, and I'm not getting that full engagement from him. Tactile accommodations, predictable spaces, predictable routines around the normal day-to-day schedule. Strategic spacing of students. So, you know, particular trauma kids, being mindful where you sit them, being flexible around where they can sit. Sometimes, you know, seating them with the rest of the peers behind them, sits their avoidant response kicks in big time. Sometimes you might need to sit them, you know, with their back against the wall, and having everyone in their sight, you know, in line of the teacher. Sometimes, for example, they need to, because you've got to think from their perspective. What looks like is obvious to you might not be as obvious to them. So you've got to use the visual cues, increase the intensity of the visual cues so that they understand. So, for example, they're in the line of vision of the teacher. There's no distractions or anything in the way of that. The clear pathway they can see, they can hear the teacher. You're increasing the intensity so they're likely to understand and be comfortable there. Flexible alternative seating, common one we get, one of those low-level interventions we can do. You know, hockey stools, wobble stools, hugely beneficial for some kids that seek a lot of movement. Just allowing, you know, having variety of different seating options in the classroom, beanbags, different areas of the classroom, having a purpose to them, you know, having I should have put their crash pad as well, you know, like in the classroom that serves a purpose. This is the space for this, that's the space for that. That's how you help those neurodiverse kids capture their sensory needs in a way that is sustainable and approved for the context, if that's your expectations. Proprioceptive vestibular accommodations, you know, routine movement breaks, like I said, you know, routines that provide regular access to proprioceptive vestibular input. So sometimes dance, jump jam. Errands has been really successful for some of those, like that kid I spoke about who's really disengaged. Aaron does two things, you know, going for a walk, giving him a job to do, go outside, help the caretaker, or go outside and do this, deliver that to the office. Part of it is getting that vestibular input and that proprioceptive input. And another part of that is I'm massaging his self-esteem. So really developing his self-esteem. I like it that you did that. Thank you for following through with that instruction. And what I'm saying is 9 times out of 10, he will like doing that. He will like following through with that task. He knows he can do that. He knows he can achieve it. And it's also appeals to him because it gets him out of that trigger environment. And, you know, I'm seeing a lot of high functioning autistic kids that like that really direct, giving them a job, they finish it, and they like following through with that instruction. So thinking, you know, having that in terms of your thinking about different options of what they can do. They don't always have to be doing what everyone else is doing in the classroom. You know, swinging, if you've got a swing, very powerful. Bike rides, really, really good. You know, any resistance type, you know, high school environments, we use the gym. Very successful with kids that seek high intensity proprioceptive, but it has to be regular. We don't do it when the wheels come off, which is often the thing is, oh, we thought about it now. What do we need to do now? That's not, in terms of my view, that's not how we do it. Meeting someone's sensory needs doesn't just happen when the wheels are coming off. It happens daily, you know. So I know this kid is on the spectrum or or neurodiverse, I know they have high sensory needs, so their program looks like this. It's kind of like a roller coaster, you know, like depending on how they show up, it might be special interest activity. And, you know, I will just give you an example of how I see it. If they show up, I always say to schools, plan A, plan B. Plan A is where it's the regular day, they're under demands, they pick some routines that you expect them to do, whether you neurodiverse or not. These are the routines I expect you to do. And I always say, morning tea with others, Pauline, we should all be expected to do that, and we should all be able to access that. And depending on how they show up, you might say special interest. The special interest we know for autistic children is hugely pleasurable and hugely calming. It takes them out of the world. It's how they connect to their other world. So you might say, as soon as you show up, you get access to your special interest, really structured. And from that, I can assume you're quite comfortable, you're quite calm, or go into a less preferred activity. You need to support those transitions with your tools. You know, it's not so much that, oh yeah, because of that, you should be able to do this. No, you still need the tools, because we know transitions as a self is really difficult for neurodiverse kids. And then after that less preferred activity, I know that that's going to challenge you. So now I'm going to throw in a really intense sensory break. So we might go outside and do some really intense proprioception, or we might do some really intense vestibular movement. And then I know from that, I might join it to a natural routine, like morning tea, for example, which would naturally bring you back down. Or if we're coming back into the classroom, we might go special interest again to kind of reset you and go, and you just have that flow. And then on the plan B, you still have your schedule, you still have your routines, but you decrease some of the demands, increase, say, time doing proprioceptive and vestibular input to kind of manage that. But it's really important that you do it daily and it's regular routine, rather than, oh, the wheels come off, because it's going to be ineffective. Because then you're dependent on the rapport of the individual, and 9 times out of 10, if they're going to get disorganized and have a meltdown, they'll have a meltdown. We're almost at the end, guys. I think 2 more slides. Teaching strategies and classroom practices. So, you know, clear, consistent, predictable routines, multi-sensory delivery on learning, multiple means of expression and representation. Make sure you've got all those different, capturing all those systems. Visual schedules and strong use of visual cues. Visual cues are hugely important. If you watch these kids, even the most distractible kid, they are very driven by the visual cues, and that's how they organize themselves. And they already pick up on those ones we don't even have to tell them. So that really supports your routines and supports what you want them to do. Allow use of digital tools and technology. You know, just thinking that, you know, sometimes we push so hard with writing that it's just better we try something else, and 9 times out of 10 you make more ground, you make more success doing it that way. And thinking about, you know, don't be afraid of digital tools. Consistent and routine, you know, again, time and a place. This is what we do. You can more than happy for you to do a movement break, but this is where it happens. When we're in this space, we do this or that. That's how you keep them functioning within school. Clear boundaries and rules that are consistent, realistic, and allow for natural consequences. Expectations are flexible, but also can be adjusted, and education and universal awareness for the whole class can be really beneficial, particularly with those high functioning autistic kids that need to see that it's okay, that we're all different. The teacher's showing me that she does this to regulate, so I'm feeling a bit better about what I'm doing. So these are some of the problems. You know, classrooms are uniquely challenging, can be unpredictable. As I said to you, students can perceive academic environments as overwhelming, and sometimes the stress response can be really instinctive. They've had it over and over, and it's really impactful. You know, big, intense behaviors. Trauma kids can be hugely challenging at times to get them maintained. So you really have to adjust your expectations and focus on 1 or 2 things that are crucial. So are they coming to school? Tick box, fantastic. Next thing, are they staying at school? 2 goals. How do we make that happen? And sometimes maladaptive development in consistent ways happen. You know, head banging. That's a hard one to change. You've really got to, you know, it's a hard one to kind of substitute because it feels so good for that student. I think we had the last slide now. Conclusion. So, you know, it's about being proactive, not reactive. An open mindset, expectations realistic and adjustable. You always need to reflect it and collaborate and review, and always acknowledge the strengths and team within the team. You know, because some people will be better dealing with this and others better at doing this, and consistency and follow through is key, and learning to self-regulate builds lifelong skills beyond the classroom. I think we're at the end now.
Thank you so much for that, Sasha. That was amazing. We really do appreciate it. And mentioning executive functions is really important, which is probably something that would be really cool to look at. Okay, so what's next? Remember to connect, tell other RTLB about the coming webinars, inspire what has worked for you, let people know, let us know, uplift. Please take the time to share and praise yourself and others. We are all doing a great job and we often forget it. Our next session is a session with Shelley Moore. She will be joining us for a 30-minute Q&A. We will ask for questions on your registration because she's wanting the questions beforehand so she can prepare. This is a little bit out of our normal routine. It's going to be at 8 a.m. on the 17th of October, which is term 4. So once we get the registration, we'll get it out to you, and please register for that. RTLB Aotearoa, a space to connect, inspire and uplift each other. There is a Facebook page and that is a QR code to it. Join our groups on the website page. And over to you, Fee. Hoping we didn't lose Fee in the ether. We may have lost Fee. Okay, I'll give this a go, guys. Fee seems to have fallen off. Maybe the internet's not so good up there. Okay, kia tau te manaakitanga, ki runga, ki tēnā a tātou. Kia piki te ora, kia piki te maramatanga, kia hoki pai atu, kia hoki pai mai. Tuturu whakamaua, kia tina